Well, this is a tutorial using charcoal and vine charcoal on a toned ground. So here's a general arrangement of my equipment. Harder pencils for details on the left, mid-range for shadow planes, soft ones for hair, charcoal pencil holder, erasers, kneaded eraser, hard one, shaft pencil erasers, and then into the vine charcoals. Vine and willow charcoal of different lengths, the longer ones so I could reach over the top and see what I'm drawing. These are my white charcoal pencils of different manufacturers, a couple gray ones in there as in-betweens, and then my brushes. So soft one for brushing off the junk off of them, and different sizes and hardnesses to spread the charcoal, along with this fan brush here to get really soft edges. So for this demo, I'm using this photograph of this woman who runs an inn in Western Tibet that we stayed at while we were there. I picked this one because of the structure of her face, the uniqueness of it, and obviously her personality, which I'm going to try to make part of this drawing, even though it's from a photograph. The idea is that it's just not a cold representation, but it brings in some of her friendliness and part of her warm inner being into the drawing. So the objective right at this moment is to just get the general shape of her face. The width, the height, the general location of where the features are. You can see I'm using a vertical axis line and horizontal axis lines to be able to locate the distance between things. Right now I'm just sort of eyeballing it. If I was using a live model as my focal point, what I'd be doing is I'd be lifting that pencil up or that piece of charcoal up and measuring across, which you'll see in a little while. But right now, I'm using vine charcoal because it's very forgiving. It's very soft. I can get rid of it at a moment's notice. I'm trying to kind of look at the line quality. The hardness of it is the deeper folds, probably where the deeper shadows are. But you can see I'm just shaping things out, making little readjustments. You know, there's the part of the hair. There's the forehead plane, so it's going to be very planar. So these are the shape designs. So I'm just actually using these areas, using the shapes that I see. Locating the corners of the mouth, corners of the chin. Again, notice I'm just kind of bopping around and seeing the general overall tenor of everything before I commit to where the actual forms and where the actual features are. So I'm going from the big general overall shapes, making little notations here and there, and now just sort of angle setting. I'm going to come in with a charcoal pencil now, and I'm making a little bit more, say prescribed, certain little notations on things. But still, if you notice, I go around the entire area, sort of reaffirm, re-ask myself questions about where the features are located, the shape of them. So you can see I'm angle sighting a lot of stuff. Now ultimately, as I put all these shapes together, I have to really nail down on the measurements. And usually I don't do this, but for demonstrational purposes, I'll get this ruler out. And you can see I do this guesstimation, right? I look for coincidences where angles and where distances sort of correspond together. And again, that's when holding up a pencil and making sure those measurements line up in a live drawing really super helps you. So one thing you might notice as we continue here, we're going to move into a close-up, is that a couple different things. Number one, as I erase, I don't erase really hard. I don't want to ruin the texture of the paper. If I ruin the texture of the paper, it's going to be harder to do the other steps over the top, and there'll be a lot of inconsistencies in your mark making. The second of all is that I'm using the rougher side of the Canson paper. So a lot more holes and divots to be able to hold the charcoal that we're going to use, the vine charcoal, which is soft later on. It creates its own positives and negatives. The negatives is that it does make your model's sort of tactile skin look a little bit rougher. It does hold the charcoal a little bit more. As we move on to the nose and the eyes, you can see that's where I'm really focusing on. And instead of trying to draw a nose or draw eyeballs and a pupil in the iris, I come around and hit the planes a lot more. And again, we go back to that shape design I was talking about, readjusting, re-looking at the proportions of things as opposed to, the realness of it. Because again, I'm going to be putting lights and darks on top of this chart, different kinds of charcoal, white and black and vine. And so I'm actually not really overly worried about the realness of it. I'm doing this as the planning stages, the readjustments. Perhaps you also notice that I don't use just one heavy line. I build my line up over a series of strokes and marks, erase, go back into it, reassign different kind of line quality. A lighter line usually means that there's more of a passageway between one tone and another as opposed to a high contrast. Again, giving myself some boundaries where the lights and darks are going to go later when you see I block it in. So I'm trying to plan ahead as much as possible with this part of the drawing. Now as we move down to the eyes and the nose here, I'm becoming a little bit more self-assured about where everything is going. Still watching the angle sides, so notice I'm not rounding out a lot of stuff. That'll come later when I put the other materials on it. When I go down to the nose, you can see it goes from just basically an inverted T, and then I start to bring out the core shadow in the front of the nose and the nostrils, kind of reaffirm where they are in relationship to the eyes. You can see the vertical sort of drop lines or angle sights coming off the corner of the nose and down. There's little notations. There's the bottom, a slight curve because it fits on top of the mouth rather than flat. There's a little curving size there. As we move on here, you can see I'm going to move down into where the mouth is. We're going to pull out a little bit, and now you can see, like, there's the corner to the mouth. I sort of bracket that in. I see where the roundness of where the upper fan of the mouth and the nose comes down and sort of tucks into the corners of the mouth. And then back up, you can see that vertical plane that goes up into the bridge of the nose, and then I check the distance in between the eyes. So a lot of times I'll go from vertical to horizontal measurements to diagonal measurements. So as we move down to the lower part of the chin and the mouth here, you can see there's a lot more soft tissue on this woman here. So what I'm doing is, again, I'm trying to keep it as angular as possible, but now I'm sort of swinging and swaying, curving the lines a little bit more, picking up stuff like the core shadow, picking up the planes in there. These core shadows are those smaller, lighter shadows next to an outside contour line that helps give the illusion that the form is dropping back in space. Again, we're just at the planning stages right now. I'm just setting up the design for my drawing as opposed to the finish. Right now I know I'm putting a lot of little spidery lines in here, these little plane lines. Again, this will be disappearing back into the drawing later. I'm not that concerned with that. So just a little warning as we fade into our next piece of film here that we're going to have a couple of skulls in here to show us the basic structure of the face and the cheekbones and the shading. You can see that very evident on the inside of her face, especially the high cheekbones that Tibetans have. So now what we're doing is we're moving back to the eyes here. So I'm getting closer and closer, measuring it out, still making some readjustments. But now I got a much better idea of where those fit into the head and how I fit into the general structure of that nose area. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the proportions and the angle sights. There's much better tutorials. I've cut a couple on YouTube. They're there already. There's other artists that have done them. There's the Loomis version, which is really knowledgeable. Inform yourself on that, but all of those measurements and all of that proportional canon really works. But again, each model has its own set of problems and differences than what you see in a classical text. So what you see here in a second is I'm going to use a pencil to sort of get those base measurements. I'll be using the bottom of the nose. The bottom of the nose is sort of equal to the width of the eyes. And then I'll move that measurement up vertically to check the length of the nose. Now, it just happens to work for this model. Other models have longer noses and other proportions. So at this point in the drawing, everything's coming together. I pull back just to show you that I take another pass on it where I make sure all the pieces work together in concert. So it forms out a whole composition. So before I go into this next step, I'm checking all the proportions. I'm looking at how the neck works with the face. I got the plane lines, the cheeks all built up. As you can see, I'm sort of bouncing around everything. There's the necklaces, collars. Again, shape design, I'm just shaping everything out. Not worried so much about finish, just placing everything. Getting pretty confident about where everything's fitting together, right? Okay, so in this section what I'm doing is I'm making one last pass, sort of sitting back for a second, making sure that the proportions are, 85, 90% there. And before I pitch on to the next section, which is going to be adding the vine charcoal to this. Now what I'm doing at this point is I'm adding the shadow pattern to it. Coming with the vine charcoal with a pretty light hand. You notice a big long piece so I can really kind of reach out in front of me and see what I'm doing rather than hovering over the top of it. Giving kind of a horizontal non-committal stretch to it. I know this is all going to change by the time I get done with it. But again, it gives me a shadow pattern. It gives me a trail or pathway that I can follow with different densities of stroking. So at this point, I'm looking for more of a rhythm or a cohesiveness of the shading. Not so much the density of it, or the completeness of it, or even the correctness of it. It just gives me a good underpinning, a strategic block in to see what the next steps will be. Looking at the secondary areas like the other side of the head, and then backing underneath the eyes, and then the whole design. So this next section, watch the corner of the mouth when I start to block in the slightly darker mid-tone shadow values on the cheek, on the mouth, and the verticals, to add a little bit more density to it. And in this section, what I'm going to do is show you where that initial design, those charcoal lines, how they're still there. And they don't quite get lost, and they help guide where you're going to put the values. If we move up into the eyes, you can see the same thing, those planar lines, where I leave those in. So my little kind of blockage ways, my little walls to stop the shadows from going all over. So I'm going to come back in here now, and I'm going to start to use the brushes on the Now you can see we spent up the time lapse of the film a bit. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the soft brush and I'm moving it over to the face and not trying to make the surface that soft. It's more about picking up the ambient and bounce light, which is a little bit on the softer side that I know I'm going to be putting different sort of charcoal over the top of later. But again, this goes with that shadow pattern, and the vine charcoal I'm putting right now and sort of roughens in some of the more deeper shadows. Right now I'm sort of building up more of the contrast a little bit more, not drastic, not really high contrast, but just enough where I can start to look at the differences in fabric and skin and bone, influence on the surface and the hair, adding a little bit more kind of atmosphere to it. Again, moving around the entire thing, making judgments about eventually where it's going to go or what possibilities there are to put in the drawing later. As you can see, I'm also using different brushes. Like this is a very soft brush, so it moves the charcoal around a lot, moves it over the top of it, and doesn't really commit to the surface. Then I'll use a harder brush that'll push the charcoal into the paper a little bit more. And then the soft one, where if I have to go a little bit more detail or smaller planes, I'll punch on that a little bit. So again, at this point, I'm going to be building up those rhythms a little bit more. Lights on the top of the forms, shadows underneath. You can see that I'm adding a little bit more density with that vine charcoal. Vine charcoal I can still kind of unbury myself out of. It's not that committal. The nice thing about the vine charcoal is it's changeable. Is I can move into it, add and subtract. And again, building up this sort of general overall plan that I can add to and subtract to later. And I like to build up a nice sort of atmospherical background that acknowledges the ground, the paper that it's on, rather than just being a sort of a cardboard cutout. One thing you might notice right now is I'm cleaning up the upper planes of the face, getting ready for the next step of this. And so I formed that kneaded eraser out into like a little spear and just gently sort of take off the top surface of where the highlights are going to go. That's really scrubbing into the paper, being pretty light with it, pretty surgical. So I've changed over and now I'm using an eraser that has a retractable head. It's much smaller. You can even carve it with an X-Acto knife to get a clean edge to it if you don't want any smudges. So again, what I'm doing is I'm just coming out here now sort of erasing out where the highlights are going to go. At this point, I'll be using that soft dagger brush to erase the eraser parts, the little smudges and junk that's left. That softens up some areas, but you don't want that stuff getting into your drawing. It can really, really wreck it. So with my high production values, you can see where the light's generally coming from, and a little inset, little call out on the left-hand side where the core shadow is and where the highlights are. What I'm doing with the brush is basically showing you where the tops of those highlights are going to go. Now if you look at the diagram on the left, you can see where the core shadows and where the highlights are. The core shadows are the darkest areas, highlights are the whitest areas. Both are onto the inside of the form. And so in the drawing right now, what I'm doing is I'm building up a really light core shadow. Again, where one form, one plane turns from one side to another, generally has a darker sort of edge to it. Same thing with the highlights. The highlights very rarely are on the outside edge. Most of the time they're on the end, where the highlight's turning away from the light, or it's bouncing off at the highest intensity. So one thing you can't really see at this point is the fact that I'm really going back and forth and experimenting with a lot of these values. And I realize at this point that it's a little choppy here and a little choppy there, but what I'm trying to do is just basically see how these soft values, sometimes hard edges, sometimes softer edges, kind of conflict sometimes get to look like that area, right? I just put on the cheeks pretty choppy, not overly crazy with it. I built up the mouth a little bit too much, and sometimes you go a little bit over the edge just to see what is accomplished in the drawing. Like right there, I gave her a little bit too much of a dark line. Looks like she almost has a mustache, so I have to get rid of that real quick. I realize that, and then go back in and reinforce where the mouth is. So I'll tell you, I have done hundreds of portraits, and sometimes they get sort of out of control and out of my hands. And on this one, I got a little bit, as I went into it, just to tell you the truth, it just got a little bit past me. And I had to sit back and take a 20-minute break and rethink what I was doing, right? Because that is one thing I'm doing, is I'm looking at this and experimenting. I'm making comparisons about the objective that I have and what's coming out. Frankly, I got to this part of the drawing and I sort of thought to myself, there's no way I'm going to be able to fix this thing. I almost started completely over again. But I thought, you know what? It's best to just try to fix it. So I moved on, readjusting, reevaluating, and then coming up with solutions. So in this next section, you're going to really see me go back and forth between charcoal pencils, vine charcoal, move things around. I realize the mouth is slightly off. It's a little bit to the left. I'm going to have to change that later. I build that surface up. It's hard working with that rough surface. Come in with an eraser, come back in underneath the chin, get that bounce light coming off her scarf into that rounded, more puffy lower part of her chin. You can see I'm taking a brush and softening some areas up. I'm just juggling all over the place for solutions here. Now it's organized. I know what I'm doing as I'm doing it. I know there's a plan there. And I'm also testing out what the results are. It's not a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination. This is a process, right? We're sort of adding and subtracting. I know there's going to be that white charcoal that's going to go in after this. But I'm just trying to make sure that I get the rhythm of everything built up first before I commit to that. You can see the same back and forth process going on here in the lower part of the eyes and the upper part of the mouth, where I erase, take a brush to it, soften it up, come back with a charcoal pencil, build that up, need an eraser, take a little bit more of that ambient light, that mid-tone, see if I can connect them together. That's what that is. I'm using that middle light to connect those two forms together. Come up and sort of bounce around on the eyes a little bit. See if my theories are working. Check the proportions. Switch pencils. You can see I'm switching from one pencil to another, get different textures, even a different feel in my hands. Again, hopefully what you're going to come up with is this concert of different methodologies and techniques to build your drawing up. Also, it's still keeping it a little bit on the angular side, right? Even though I'm using a brush, still not really ready to commit to that because no one's really making me commit to it. So I just want to make sure I get it right. Now I'm moving into a little bit more specific sort of information in the eyes. Pupil, the iris, setting them in there a little bit more. Kind of doing with some small, if you want to call them details. I prefer information rather than details. Even get a little bit of texture of the eyebrow up there. Building that up, going across the top of the nose. Seeing if I can kind of hit that bridge and connect them a little bit more. A little scratchy, not too quite crazy about that, but working through it. You can see there I take the brush and knock it back a little bit, soften it up. Don't want too much of a hard edge on my model. Having said that, I also want to acknowledge that she comes from a very rugged, stark area, and she's definitely got that age on her face a little bit, the roundness of it there, but I want to make sure that I keep that nice combination of the elements there, the soft and the hard, and still get that really wonderful kind of gaze in her eyes. Okay, so at this point we're going to add the gray, light gray and white charcoal into it to raise the forms off the paper a little bit more. And I put our little diagrams back up there, so again you can see the highlights and turning the form using the different direction of the marks at different intensities. I don't really go to anything really super white, similar to not going super dark. Before, I'm sort of trying to hit that middle ground, get a rhythm built up, as you can see. Not really if you notice, I'm not taking the whites and jamming them up right against the charcoal I put down. I'm getting close, and you'll see when we do close-ups that I'm not quite hitting the edges on a lot of stuff. Maybe things like the edge of the mouth where there is more of a contrast. But again, I'm just trying to get a design set up first that I can follow later. You see as I work over the head, the forms are a lot more rounded, the tones are a little more softer. When I move down into the sharpness of the scarf, those highlight lines are a lot thinner because they're going over a sharper fold, over a sharper edge. Later on in the drawing, you'll see how I start to use the textures and the weight of the line to help sort of not only pull the composition together, but at the same time make comparisons between the roundness of her face and the sharpness of the edges of her scarf that goes around her neck, and even the fabric. And if we pull our little diagram back in here, you can see those highlights are on the top of those forms. You make sure of that, you keep that organized to make sure that it has a logical kind of look to it. So now at this point, you'll see I'm going up into the eyes, making like little readjustments. Just erase here, pulling. A lot of times you'll see the strokes I'm pulling the different values and the different tones across from one side to the other. Sort of like sewing them together with those pencils, using different kinds, like the Conte pencils. Got a little bit more of a darker, softer tone to it. So I use that for eyes a lot, pupil and iris. So again, just doing a lot of suggestion at this part. I don't want to go in and commit too much. I can still make those kind of micro adjustments with the kneaded eraser, with that retractable pencil eraser. A big section of it right now, you'll notice that a lot of the tones I'm putting down aren't really harsh and contrasty. They're not high contrast of whites and blacks, but it's more the mid-tones. It's more that mid-range of values. I'm starting to kind of overlay everything to kind of help tie it together. As we move into the nose and the mouth area, you see again, it's not like really big, gigantic moves. I'm just moving the pencil around, using cross-hatching in some areas, soft tones in others, reinforcing little contrasts in here, sometimes even kind of like filling in little potholes all over the drawing to get, say, the upper part of the nose and the side plane of the nose to work. Erasing that highlight on the nose and then moving it out to the right a little bit more, makes it a little bit fuller rather than sharper. It's a good example, like little micro adjustments. Like there's that ambient light bouncing underneath the nostril and filling that in. So I'm trying to make this kind of complete form, and as I'm doing this, I'm looking at the entire composition. So as I move into the chin area here, realize that it's a lot softer. There's a lot more sort of skin and a little fat underneath the chin a little bit more roundness. So I'm taking that brush and even the pencil and just kind of softening up those edges a little bit more. It's not like the nose or the eyes where there's a lot of cartilage or there's a lot of bone at the edges of things, where it makes for a much more sharper sort of planar development. Since I'm working down in that rounded chin area, I can use that brush and really bring out more of the subtlety of the plane changes. And you can see on the left-hand side of the chin, it's not one uniform value. I've actually got small little hills of subtle lights and darks built up on the inside of it, so it makes it look a little bit more rolling and a little bit more flowing up into the cheeks. And that plays off the harder edges of, say, the nostrils or the nose and those really nice high cheekbones. It kind of pulls up into that. It makes for a really nice sort of contrast sometimes. So at this point I move on to her shoulders, into her necklaces, into the collar and the scarf that goes around her neck. Now this is personal preference, but I prefer when I do my outfits in comparison to the face and contrast to the face, so I keep it a little bit more on the elemental side. I don't try to overly render out the fabric. I have a tendency to kind of like it to contrast the face and frame the face a little bit more. So you'll see in here that, again, that really soft, velvety kind of silk top she has on, I keep the lines a little bit harder and a little bit more crunchy, so to speak, just so, again, it doesn't try to match the textures of her face. It's not that I don't want it to be distractive. What I prefer is it sort of complements and contrasts the portrait that you're drawing. Again, sort of more of a personal preference than a rule. Again, you may notice that I overly simplified a lot of the elements on the clothing and the shoulders and the jewelry. Now again, this is just what I think should happen in relationship to drawing the face. Just keep it a little bit more on a quick elemental part that will play off the softness of her portrait. So now that I'm going to be working on the left-hand side of the face, I'm going to make sure that I don't put my hand on it and smear the heck out of it. So what I do is I put this little mask on top of it, just a simple piece of notebook page, to make sure that the side of my hand as I move it back and forth doesn't smudge my results that I spent so much time on. In fact, you may notice my fingers kind of hold down the paper a little bit as I do that, just to make sure it doesn't move back and forth. Same thing with the brush, soften that up a little bit. Trying to get that kind of soft secondary tone in the cheek where it moves back in space. So if you notice, I left that big swath of hair, that dark patch of hair there as the last, and even at this point I'm changing the proportions a little bit, adding a little bit to the outside of the head. Now, the reason I didn't put the dark in first, it's really easy to smudge that stuff, and it's such a contrast that I want to make sure that I built up all my values first before I jump on that. It frames her face so well, but I certainly don't want to look like it detaches away, that darkness, that contrast detaches away from the rest of her portrait. I wanted to add to it, to frame it. And again, add a little bit of texture to the top. Going to take a few strands of hair and implant it into the top of her scalp. Add some sort of jumbled up marks there. Makes it look organized, but at the same time natural. Sure don't want to make it look like a wig. I want to keep that nice sense of it's dressy, but at the same time it looks like the hair is just pulled back. For the most part, I don't think of hair as strands of hair. It's more like planes that are catching light. That's why you'll notice the model like this, or a person like this, even with that really black hair, there's still light on the top. There's a few strands of hair I'll put in to just kind of hint at the character of it, but I won't go in there and make it look like spaghetti. It's that character that's important in it. Now we hit the home stretch. So now looking again at the whole composition, you see I'm just sort of touching it up here and there, adding little darks, adding a little line here, taking in the whole thing as a composition first, seeing if I, reinforce the cheeks, see if I need to soften stuff up, make more of an edge, more of a contrast. Okay, here we go. This is the last little part of the accents. I'm going to put the glint in the eye and a little bit of bounce light on the side of the nose. I'm going to come in here and line this up where I'm going to get that beautiful little glint, those two little highlights on the inside of there. You might notice that I simplified the glints in her eye, so when I draw those in, they point towards the direction that the light's coming. I don't want to make them look cross-eyed, so what I do is I focus a little bit to the right on each side. That I've been playing, again, that's planned for almost from the beginning. That's that layout that I did. Okay, now I'm trying to work in a little bit more roundness on the tip of the chin. Getting that bounce light off the lower lip up into the upper lip. You can see just a little bit of it. I'm even using a slightly French grape pencil here, charcoal pencil, to take the edge off, kind of round stuff out a little bit, not make it so high contrast. You can see just little surgical additions of value. Again, right at the tip of the nose, round, using that fan brush to kind of round stuff out a little bit more. You notice I might have switched over to 4 different pencils to get the right effect. Sometimes it's through the feel of your hand that you're going to get this, not so much a grade that's on the side of the pencil. You just learn it through working the materials. Okay, here we are at the last finishing touches. So now what I'm doing is adding a little bit more of the randomness to it, a few little errant hairs, make it look a little bit more natural, deciding where the jewelry is going to fit on. So those earrings that originally knocked in at first, they disappeared into that atmospheric charcoal. I'm going to bring them back up again because they help define the corner of the head and where the ears are, a little bit more depth. So I'm adding a little bit more darks into the tear ducts. In fact, one thing you might notice as I work on the earrings, how much it accents that little area between the bottom of the ears and where the scarf is. And even those 2 ellipses going back in space with the little glints on them really help kind of anchor that empty middle space there. I'm just fiddling around, adding a few little accents here and there, but that is just about it. A little bit of texture, a little bit of white of the hair for age, sort of maturity there. And now we have our model and we have our drawing to make comparisons. Again, can't help myself noodling around on it a little, but ultimately it has to exist on its own without its model, and it has to hold true. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and got some good information out of it. Thank you very much for showing up.